He was left in a nursing home without a second glance, abandoned by the very family he once sacrificed everything for. But behind the silence and the wrinkled hands was a truth no one saw coming. A hidden fortune, carefully protected, and a plan decades in the making. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about dignity, betrayal, and the unexpected legacy of a man the world tried to forget. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories reach. Enjoy the story. The car stopped without ceremony. No hugs, no tearful goodbyes, just the sound of the engine fading as the door slammed shut behind him. The old man stood still on the concrete path, one hand gripping a small worn suitcase, the other resting gently on the side of his coat like he wasn't sure if he was supposed to wait or walk. His son had said it would just be for a while, just until they could figure things out, just until the finances were better, just until things at home calmed down. But no one believed that. Not really. Not the driver, not the receptionist. Waiting by the front door, and certainly not him. He had lived long enough to recognize lies softened by guilt inside the nursing home. The air smelled like disinfectant and memory. Hallways muted with beige walls, soft footsteps, muffled coughs behind closed doors. He walked slowly, guided by a young attendant who barely looked him in the eyes, pointing out the dining area, the TV room, the weekly calendar posted on the wall with plastic smiley faces next to the word bingo. No one asked for his story. No one wanted to know who he had been. To them, he was a new bed to fill, a new name on a file. Another quiet ending. His room was small, functional. A single bed, a nightstand, a chair by the window. No photos, no books, no hint that someone had once built a life too large for a space this small. He unpacked his suitcase with methodical care, a pair of trousers, 2 cardigans, a shaving kit, a pocket watch. And at the very bottom, wrapped in an old handkerchief, a leather-bound journal, the one thing he never let out of sight. He placed it in the drawer and closed it slowly, like tucking away a secret. Dinner came early. Bland food on a beige tray. People spoke in low voices at neighboring tables, or not at all. The man across from him kept looking at the ceiling like he was waiting for it to fall. Another woman stared at her spoon like it might remember her name if she looked hard enough. The old man ate in silence. He didn't speak unless spoken to, and no one did. Not that first day. Not the second either. He had become invisible in a matter of hours, and somehow he expected it. He watched people, not with judgment, but with the patience of someone who had learned that life unfolds in whispers, not declarations. He listened more than he spoke. He observed which nurses cared and which ones only pretended to, which residents still had visitors, and which ones stared at the door hoping someone had just gotten lost. Time slowed. Days blurred. The calendar above the television was never accurate. And still, he waited in the mornings. He would sit by the window in his room and write. Not long entries, just fragments, sentences, ideas, things like, "A tree doesn't complain when its leaves fall," or, "If they knew what I left behind, would they have stayed a moment longer?" His handwriting had grown shaky, but his mind hadn't faded. It was sharp, clear. Holding on to something no one else could see, once a nurse knocked on the door and asked if he needed anything. He looked at her kindly, tilted his head and said, "I need to not be forgotten." She smiled awkwardly, not knowing how to answer, and left before he could say more. He didn't blame his son, not openly. Life was crueler now, faster. The world didn't have time for old men who used to be something. Once, he was a builder, a planner, a man who signed papers that changed city skylines. But that was another life, buried beneath years of noise. And anyway, who would believe him now? In this place, with these walls, no one asked who you were, only who would be coming to visit, and how often on the 7th night he sat at the edge of his bed with the journal in his lap. He opened it not to write, but to reread. There were pages filled with calculations, addresses, account numbers, names long forgotten by the world but not by him. He had protected something for decades, not out of greed, but out of caution. Because he had learned the hard way that when people know what you have, they see the gold before they see the man. And he wasn't ready to be seen as a vault. He wanted to be remembered as a person. That night, he scribbled one new line before closing the journal. One day, they'll find what they were really looking for, but not until they've already lost me. He placed the journal back in the drawer and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. The silence felt heavier than usual, but he didn't fear the quiet. It had always been where his truth lived, and somewhere, not far from that nursing home, the world went on, unaware that within these beige walls sat a forgotten man holding a secret that would change everything. Days passed with the rhythm of a broken clock. Nothing was urgent. Nothing ever changed. The breakfast cart rolled down the hallway every morning at exactly 7:15, carrying lukewarm oatmeal and instant coffee in plastic cups. The nurse on the early shift always mumbled good morning without waiting for a reply. Some residents watched the news with blank expressions. Others shuffled down the corridor for no reason at all, just to feel movement beneath their feet. And in room 107, the old man sat by the window with the same expression he wore the day he arrived. Distant, quiet, watching the world outside like a visitor in a life he once lived. No one asked him questions. No one knew his past. His name was on a small plaque outside his door, misspelled twice before they got it right. But no one called him by it. They called him Sir, or Mr., or nothing at all. It was easier that way. Easier to manage people when they don't have stories, when they're just a list of medications and allergies on a clipboard. He never corrected anyone, never reminded them that he had once been called CEO, that his signature had once meant construction sites broke ground and millions moved through ledgers, that he had once stood on balconies with city mayors and toasted to buildings that still touched the sky. He watched instead, observed the nurses as they came and went, the way they moved faster for the loud residents and forgot to check in on the quiet ones. He noticed which ones cut corners, who pocketed extra snacks from the pantry, who smiled out of habit and who meant it. He listened to the way they spoke when they thought no one was paying attention. Most days he barely moved, but his mind cataloged everything. He wasn't fading, he was preparing. The other residents had their routines too. There was Harold, who sat by the fish tank for hours and called every goldfish by name. Mabel, who recited lines from old movies while staring at the ceiling tiles. And Ruth, who never spoke but always held a crumpled photograph in her lap. They all had stories buried beneath years of silence, but no one listened. The staff didn't have time. The families didn't want to hear. Time had made them invisible. And yet, every now and then, the old man would scribble something about them in his journal. Notes, observations, thoughts like, Harold's goldfish are the only creatures who remember him. Or, Ruth hasn't aged, only her surroundings did. One afternoon, during recreational hour, a staff member suggested everyone draw a picture of a happy memory. Most of the residents stared at the crayons like they were foreign objects. The old man didn't participate. He simply looked down at his hands and whispered to no one, I designed 27 buildings, and now they want me to color. The remark went unnoticed. The room moved on, but that evening in his journal he wrote about the moment. You can't draw a life like mine in crayon, not because it was extraordinary, but because no one would believe it was real. He paused, then added, what you build out of silence, no one can ever steal from you. Still, the isolation wore on him in ways even he didn't expect. Some nights he'd reach for the phone instinctively, forgetting that no one would answer. He'd close his eyes and imagine voices from his past, business partners, his wife's laughter, the echo of his children running through the hallway of their first home. These weren't dreams. They were ghosts, soft ones. The kind that don't haunt you, but keep you company when the world forgets your name. One night, the nurse who worked the late shift, a young man named Daniel, stopped by to check his vitals. He was polite, not rushed, and even smiled without being forced. As he wrapped the blood pressure cuff around the old man's arm, he noticed the journal sitting on the nightstand. You write? He asked casually. The old man didn't answer, just stared. But Daniel didn't flinch. He nodded slightly and added, "I used to write too, but then life happened." The old man said nothing. But after Daniel left, he opened the journal and scribbled a new line. He noticed the notebook. That's a beginning. It was a small interaction, barely a spark. But in a place where most days were shadows of the last, it felt like something. Not hope exactly, but potential. And for the first time in weeks, the old man went to bed thinking not just about what had been lost, but what might still be possible. The world outside the nursing home kept spinning. Buildings rose, cities grew, fortunes were made and forgotten. But inside room 107, a man with no visitors, no titles, and no future sat quietly in the corner of a forgotten place, holding onto a secret worth millions and waiting to see if anyone still remembered how to see beyond what's visible. Daniel didn't belong in that place. Not really. He was too young, too awake, his eyes too curious for the kind of routine that dulled most people into silence. He had taken the job at the nursing home as a temporary thing, a gap between semesters, a paycheck while he figured things out. But there was something in him that didn't let go easily. He noticed details others missed. The way a hand trembled while reaching for a spoon. The way someone's breath changed when they were holding in a memory. The way some people said, "I'm fine," like they were begging someone to ask again. He noticed the old man in room 107 the very first week. Not because he complained, not because he made a scene, but because he didn't. He moved with the quiet of someone who had once commanded attention but no longer expected it. His clothes were always neatly arranged, his bed made without needing to be told. And yet there was something in his posture, in the way he studied the world from his chair, that said he was more than he appeared to be. Daniel started finding reasons to linger in the room longer than necessary. He'd bring medications a little early, refill the water pitcher even when it wasn't empty, straighten the blinds just to have something to do while observing the man who barely spoke. There was intelligence in his silence, precision in the way he moved. When Daniel would ask him basic questions, "How are you feeling today? You want to join the others in the lounge?" He rarely got more than a nod or a wave of the hand in response, but he kept trying. One afternoon, as he was gathering laundry from the hall, Daniel saw the old man sitting alone in the garden. That wasn't unusual. He often spent hours there. But what caught Daniel's eye was that the man wasn't looking at the flowers or the sky. He was staring at a small notebook in his lap, writing slowly with a fountain pen. Not a plastic ballpoint, but a real pen. Elegant, heavy, the kind people used when their words mattered. Daniel stepped outside, walked slowly to avoid disturbing him, and sat on the bench nearby. He didn't say anything at first, just sat. Let the moment exist. After a minute or two, he said softly, "That's a nice pen." The old man didn't look up. "It writes well," he replied after a pause. His voice was gravelly but deliberate, measured, smooth where it needs to be, sharp when it matters. Daniel smiled. "Sounds like the kind of thing you'd say about a person, not a pen." The old man didn't respond, but he didn't close the notebook either. And that was something. From that day, Daniel made a habit of showing up during the man's writing time. Never intrusive, never pushing too hard, just present. He'd talk about small things, how the food had gotten worse, which nurse secretly played jazz at the front desk when no one was listening, how one of the residents had escaped bingo night by pretending to sleep through it. And slowly, the old man began to respond, one word at a time, a comment here, a smirk there. Nothing big, but it was a beginning. What struck Daniel the most was how the man listened. When Daniel spoke, the old man wasn't just being polite. He was paying attention, not to the words but to the spaces between them. The way Daniel's voice tightened when he mentioned his father. The way he looked down when he said he wasn't sure what came next. The old man didn't ask personal questions. He didn't need to. He understood without needing to be told. One day, Daniel noticed a line in the notebook. It had been left open on the windowsill by mistake. Or maybe not. The words were written in the same careful hand as always, and they read, "He sees. That's rare." It stopped Daniel in his tracks. He wanted to ask what it meant, but didn't. Not yet. Instead, he simply nodded to the old man that afternoon, and the old man nodded back, a silent agreement that something had changed between them. It was in these small, unspoken exchanges that a quiet bond began to form. One built not on family ties, not on obligation, but on something much rarer: recognition. The kind of recognition that happens when one soul quietly acknowledges another. Daniel didn't know what the old man had lived through. He didn't know what secrets were written between the pages of that notebook. But he knew there was something there, something unfinished, something important, and the old man, though he never said it, knew exactly what he was doing. He had been waiting for someone to notice, not his family, not the world, just one person, one who would ask the right questions, not out loud, but through presence, through patience, through seeing him not as a number in a system, but as a man, with a story worth hearing. What neither of them knew yet, not fully, was that this connection would unravel everything, that it would unearth a secret buried deeper than money, and that the fortune no one believed existed was only the beginning of a legacy waiting to be unlocked. It was during one of those silent mornings, when most residents were still being dressed, or slowly making their way to the breakfast room, that Daniel returned to room 107 and found the journal lying open on the bed. The old man wasn't there, perhaps in the restroom or already out walking the garden path. But the book, always guarded, always closed, now sat face up, pages fluttering gently in the breeze from the slightly cracked window. Daniel paused in the doorway, torn between respect and curiosity. His job taught him to avoid overstepping, but something about that journal called to him like a door half open, as if it wanted to be found. He stepped closer and glanced down at the page, not out of disrespect, but almost instinct, like it was meant for someone who could understand. The ink was neat, the letters firm, though the strokes carried a tremor, age perhaps, or the weight of the words. There was a list, not a grocery list or daily schedule, but a strange inventory. A town name he didn't recognize, a date, 1973, coordinates, a bank name, and beneath it all, a single sentence: "Only the one who listens will know where to look." Daniel closed the book softly and placed it back on the nightstand. His mind raced. It wasn't the first time he'd seen the man writing cryptic thoughts, but this felt different. Like it wasn't just memory being preserved. It was instruction, clues, a message buried in plain sight. And the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. The old man was too sharp to be spending his final days simply reminiscing. There was something he was trying to pass on, quietly, intentionally, to the right person. Later that afternoon, Daniel brought him tea and sat by the window, watching the light stretch across the carpet. The old man didn't speak, but he didn't seem surprised to see him. After a few minutes, Daniel cleared his throat and said, "You used to build things, didn't you?" The man looked at him, calm but curious. Daniel continued, "Not just structures, systems, things that last." The old man smiled faintly. "People always think permanence comes from concrete," he said, "but it's paper that survives." Then he turned his gaze back to the window. It wasn't much, but it was confirmation. Daniel went home that night with thoughts swirling. He searched the town name from the journal entry. It was real. A small, near-forgotten place 3 hours away. Population, under 800. The kind of town where people still knew each other's middle names and old secrets lived in the walls. He tried searching the bank too, but it had closed years ago, absorbed by a larger chain. Still, something about it tugged at him. He began taking notes of his own. Every phrase the old man dropped, every detail in the journal he could recall. He wasn't after money. He didn't even believe there was any. Not really. What intrigued him was the story, the mystery, the sense that something sacred had been buried beneath years of silence and shame, and that maybe, just maybe, it was meant to be uncovered by someone who wasn't trying to take, but trying to understand. The next few days, Daniel continued to show up during writing hours, sometimes with a second cup of tea, sometimes just with a book to read nearby. The old man never questioned it, and slowly the wall between them thinned. They started to talk, not about family, not about illness, but about ideas, about architecture, about what it means to build something that outlives you, about how some of the most valuable things in life are the ones we never tell anyone about. Then, one morning, as Daniel walked in, the old man was waiting. The journal was closed, sitting on the windowsill, and he tapped it lightly with one hand. "You've been watching," he said. Daniel nodded, trying to understand. He replied. The old man studied him for a long moment, then asked, "If I told you something valuable was hidden, would you take it?" Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, but I might protect it, or use it the way you meant it to be used." The old man exhaled, long and slow. He didn't smile, but something in his posture softened. He turned to the journal and slid it across the table between them. "Read carefully," he said. "There's more between the lines than in them." And that was it. A simple gesture, a quiet passing of a burden. But to Daniel, it felt like being handed the key to a hidden door. He took the journal that night, carefully copied its contents page by page, and returned it the next morning without a word. From then on, everything changed. The home still buzzed with the same fluorescent silence. The nurses still moved in mechanical rhythms. But Daniel had found a thread, and he was ready to pull. What he didn't know yet, what the old man had not yet revealed, was that the journal wasn't just a puzzle. It was a map. The door hadn't opened in months, not by them, not for him. His family had vanished the day they left him at the home, fading from memory as quickly as they'd exited the parking lot. There were no birthday cards, no weekend visits, not even a call to check if he was still breathing. The staff had stopped asking. The other residents didn't mention it. It was the unspoken rule of places like this: those who are forgotten stay forgotten until someone remembers for the wrong reasons. That morning, the silence was broken. A black SUV pulled into the visitor's lot and sat idling for a few minutes before the engine turned off. The first to step out was his son, pressed shirt, sunglasses, cell phone in hand. Next came the daughter-in-law, the one who always looked at him like he was a burden wrapped in skin. And behind them, a grandson he hadn't seen since high school, now grown into a man with a jawline carved by ambition. They looked around, unsure of the building, as if they were entering a stranger's home. Daniel saw them through the lobby window as they approached. He recognized the features immediately. The same set of the jaw, the same piercing blue eyes. Genetics didn't lie, but what struck him most was how they walked. Not with guilt, not with humility, with expectation, like they were coming to collect something, not reconnect. He stood by the hallway watching as they signed in, smiled politely at the front desk, and asked for Mr. Ellis. "Room 107, please." The old man was sitting by the window when they arrived. He didn't turn around at the sound of their footsteps, didn't flinch when the door opened. He simply kept looking at the sky like it held the only truth left in the world. The son cleared his throat. "Hey, Dad, we thought it was time to drop by. Been meaning to for a while." No apology, no explanation, just casual words layered with practiced charm. The old man turned slowly, eyes sharp and unreadable, and nodded once. "You're late," he said. That was all. They brought gifts: a framed photo, a robe, a fruit basket still wrapped in cellophane. Daniel watched from a distance, unseen, noting how none of them asked about his health, or his daily routine, or how he had been treated. Instead, they danced around him with questions disguised as interest. "So how's your memory these days? You still have that lawyer, what's his name? Do you remember where you kept all those old files?" The grandfather answered, in riddles, just enough to keep them wondering. He smiled when they asked about the journal, but gave no confirmation. When the daughter-in-law mentioned how expensive things were lately and how they had been thinking about downsizing, he simply said, "Money makes people disappear faster than time ever could." And when the grandson, who hadn't spoken all visit, finally asked, "Do you still trust us?" The old man looked at him for a long, heavy moment and replied, "I never said I did. They didn't stay long, less than 40 minutes. Enough time to feel justified in future conversations. Enough time to post a photo outside the building to prove they had been there." Daniel passed them in the hallway as they left, and the son gave him a nod. Not friendly, not thankful, just a nod. That said, "We see you, but we don't need to." That evening, the old man sat with Daniel in the garden. The sky was turning amber. Leaves rustled like they knew something no one else did. Daniel didn't ask about the visit. He didn't need to. After a long silence, the old man said, "They're circling. Smelled the trail." Daniel nodded. "Because of what's in the journal?" The old man didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because of what they think they're owed." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a smaller envelope, worn, sealed. He held it out to Daniel without looking at him. "If something happens to me before I finish explaining, give this to the lawyer. Only him. You'll know when." Daniel took it carefully, the paper soft from age, heavy with consequence. He didn't ask what was inside. The gesture said enough. Trust, earned through silence. Responsibility, handed down without a speech. That night, Daniel watched the family's SUV leave the parking lot. He knew they'd be back. They'd start calling. They'd want answers. They'd pretend to care. But the old man had seen it all before. And now, with the journal in Daniel's hands and secrets that reached far beyond memory, the game had changed. They thought they were coming to reclaim a man they'd forgotten. But they didn't know he had already chosen who would remember him. The envelope stayed hidden in Daniel's drawer for 3 days. He didn't touch it, didn't open it, not because he was afraid of what it contained, but because he understood the weight of things sealed shut. The old man hadn't given him a key. He'd given him a torch, a responsibility, and Daniel wasn't about to light a match in the dark without knowing where the flame might spread. He kept reading the journal, each night turning pages like they were puzzle pieces, mapping not just a mind but a life deliberately obscured. It wasn't just a record of memories. It was a coded legacy. Certain names appeared again and again. Obscure corporations, land references, banks that no longer existed, but left a paper trail if you knew where to look. One phrase stood out to Daniel above the rest. Things that disappear are not always lost. Sometimes they are hiding in plain sight. That line echoed in his head the morning he called the number scribbled on the inside cover of the journal. It rang twice before a man answered. Calm, clipped voice. "Foster and Langdon Law." Daniel hesitated, then spoke. "I'm calling. On behalf of Roy Ellis. He told me to contact this number, if the time ever came." A pause. Silence. Then, "Has it come?" They met the next day, not in an office, but at a quiet diner 2 towns over. The lawyer, older, gray suit, eyes sharp like a hawk, introduced himself as Mr. Langdon. He didn't ask Daniel many questions, just opened a briefcase and pulled out a folder labeled Hold Until Death or Designated Disclosure. Inside were documents that didn't look like anything Daniel had ever seen. Estate filings, land deeds, trust agreements, foreign account ledgers, and most astonishing of all, a sealed addendum to a last will and testament, all with Roy Ellis's name signed at the bottom in bold, confident ink. Langdon laid them out one by one. "Your grandfather," he said without hesitation, "has assets that have been concealed under shell names and trusts for nearly 3 decades. Quietly, intentionally. As of last quarter, the total value, assuming no liquidation penalties, stands just under $12.8 million. Daniel blinked. 12 million? Langdon nodded once, conservatively, not counting the property in Veracruz or the Swiss account. It didn't feel real. Not in a place where Daniel earned $14 an hour handing out meds and wiping down dining trays. Not in a world where the man everyone had written off as broken and poor had been silently guarding a fortune that could rebuild lives. And yet, it made sense. The journal, the fragments, the warnings, the silence. Langdon explained further. Roy had prepared for every possibility. The trust had a succession clause. The will had a private codicil. No one in the family had access to any of it, not without the final key. And that key, Langdon explained, was not legal. It was personal. He chose someone to carry it, the lawyer said, not because of bloodline, but because of character. He told me, I'm not giving it to someone who wants it. I'm giving it to someone who'd never ask for it. He looked at Daniel. Pointedly, Daniel leaned back in his chair, the weight of the truth pressing into his chest like gravity. He gave me an envelope, he said quietly. Langdon nodded. Then it's yours to decide. If you open it, the inheritance activates. If you destroy it, it disappears with him. The accounts go dormant. The assets remain buried. He left the choice to you. That night, Daniel sat in his tiny apartment and stared at the envelope. The light from the kitchen flickered slightly. Old wiring, unimportant. But everything else in the room had changed. The envelope wasn't just paper. Now, it was legacy. Not wealth. Legacy. A man's decision to be remembered not for what he had, but for what he protected. Daniel didn't feel worthy. But maybe that was the point. Maybe only someone who doubted they deserved it could ever be trusted to hold it right. The next morning, he returned to the nursing home. The old man was in his chair, same window, same silence. Daniel sat beside him. Neither spoke. Then Daniel said, I met him. Langdon. The old man didn't move, but his eyes closed slowly, as if releasing a breath he'd been holding for years. And? He asked. Daniel placed the envelope on the table. I didn't open it. A long pause. Then Roy said, Good. You already understand more than they ever did. In that moment, Daniel understood something even deeper. The money was never the test. The secrecy wasn't about paranoia. It was about intention. Roy had spent a lifetime building not just wealth, but wisdom. And now he had chosen someone to carry it forward. But the test wasn't over. Because news travels fast in families that smell fortune, and the wolves were already circling again. It began with a phone call. The front desk at the nursing home buzzed Daniel while he was restocking the med cart. There's someone here asking for Mr. Ellis's medical records, the receptionist said, her voice uncertain. Says he's family, but I don't know. He's pushy. Daniel felt the shift immediately, the tremor in the air when vultures began to circle. He made his way to the lobby, and there they were, all of them, like ghosts made flesh. Roy's eldest son was front and center, sharp tie, polished shoes, his voice full of forced patience. Beside him, the daughter-in-law held a clipboard and a too-wide smile. Behind them, the grandson wore a hoodie and avoided eye contact, scrolling on his phone. They looked around the room like tourists surveying a museum, polite, disconnected. Opportunistic Daniel, the son said, extending a hand like they'd met more than once. We were hoping to sit down with the nursing director, maybe talk about Dad's long-term plan. We've had some concerns lately about his care, about where things are going. Daniel didn't shake the hand. He looked at each of them, his silence saying more than any words could. He's safe, Daniel said. He's well, and he doesn't want visitors today. That should have been the end of it. But Roy's son stepped closer, his smile tightening. Come on now, he's family. We're trying to reconnect. We just think maybe there are things he hasn't told us, things we should help him manage. He emphasized the word manage like it carried hidden claws. Daniel didn't flinch. If you're here to reconnect, come back with sincerity. If you're here to manage money, you're late. The daughter-in-law's tone dropped its sweetness. Are you implying we don't care about him? That we've abandoned him? Daniel met her gaze. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating it. They didn't get what they came for that day, but they didn't leave quietly. Over the next week, Daniel noticed the changes. Deliveries showing up in Roy's room without being ordered. Letters arriving with false signatures. Nurses getting calls asking about medication routines. It was a campaign, a strategy. The family wasn't just circling. They were preparing to take control. And still, Roy said nothing. He observed everything. One morning, Daniel brought him his tea and asked, Did you know they'd come like this? Roy gave a half smile. They don't know how to show love. Only interest. So what now? Daniel asked. Roy turned to the window. Now we wait. Money makes men move, but silence controls the map. Daniel began documenting everything. The conversations, the gifts, the inquiries. He contacted Langdon, who confirmed the family had attempted to access financial records through probate inquiries, but none of them had the legal key. They were circling an empty vault, unaware the door they wanted was sealed by something stronger than law. Trust. Then one evening, Daniel returned to Roy's room and found him sitting at the edge of the bed, a stack of old photographs in his lap. They were faded, fragile. A woman in a floral dress, children laughing in front of a lake. Roy held one photo for a long time before handing it to Daniel. That one was taken the day after I sold my first property, he said. Made a promise to her that day, that we'd never live like kings, but we'd never leave each other behind. Daniel nodded slowly. She's beautiful. Roy didn't smile. She died believing our children would carry that promise forward. She never saw what they became when they thought no one was watching. He placed the photo back in the box and closed it carefully. The problem with money is that it invites everyone to pretend they care, but time reveals who was acting. Over the next few days, the family returned again and again. They brought cakes, balloons, old photo albums they hadn't touched in years. They spoke in soft tones and asked leading questions. Roy responded with calm pleasantries. Nothing more. But Daniel saw the toll it took. After each visit, the old man grew quieter, as if each false smile chipped away at something real inside him. Then came the final blow. A legal letter, delivered by courier, addressed to Roy. Inside, a formal petition for guardianship, signed by his son, requesting full financial control due to mental decline. Daniel read it twice, his hands shaking. Roy didn't speak. He simply folded the letter, placed it beside the journal, and whispered, "They never came to say goodbye, only to calculate what I'm worth." That night, Daniel made a decision. He called Langdon. "I'm ready," he said. "Open the envelope." The envelope had always felt heavier than it looked. Not because of its contents, but because of the meaning sealed inside it. Now, as Daniel handed it over to Langdon in a quiet office above an old bookstore, a place chosen specifically to keep the meeting invisible, he felt that weight shift from secrecy to consequence. Langdon opened it without ceremony. He didn't hesitate. He had done this before. But as the seal broke, Daniel held his breath like he was cracking open a door to a different version of the world. Inside was a single letter, handwritten, like every page of the journal, neat, structured, deliberate. Langdon read it silently, then handed it to Daniel without a word. The first line struck like thunder. "This letter stands as my final directive regarding the disposition of all assets held under the Ellis Family Trust and its satellite holdings. I, Roy Thomas Ellis, hereby name Daniel Clark as the sole executor and beneficiary of my estate." Daniel blinked. Once, twice. The words didn't change. He kept reading. "This is not a decision made lightly. It is not based on blood. It is not based on obligation. It is based on one thing alone: integrity." Daniel saw me when I had nothing to offer. He listened when others only calculated. And he never asked what he could gain, only what he could understand. For that, he earns everything. It was signed and dated. The ink faded slightly at the edge, smudged by time or maybe a trembling hand. Daniel lowered the letter slowly, trying to steady the thoughts racing through his mind. Executor, beneficiary. Words that belonged in boardrooms, not nursing homes. Words that changed everything and explained even more. Langdon cleared his throat, then laid out a folder of documents. "We'll begin the legal transfer after his passing," he said. "Until then, nothing moves, nothing leaks. If the family challenges it, this letter is final. He's protected every angle. We're not just transferring money, Daniel. We're protecting his intent." Daniel nodded, the weight pressing down harder now. Not the weight of guilt, but of purpose. Of being chosen not for being the smartest or the strongest, but for being the one who didn't look away. He hadn't earned it by blood. He had earned it by staying when no one else did. That night, he returned to the nursing home. Roy was in his chair, the TV flickering with an old film he wasn't watching. Daniel sat beside him and waited. After a few minutes, he simply said, "It's done." Roy didn't ask what that meant. He didn't need to. He looked over at Daniel with the kind of calm that only comes from knowing you've left your world in good hands. "You're not like them," he said. "They count inheritance in numbers. You'll count it in people." Daniel nodded. "What do you want me to do with it?" Roy smiled for the first time in days. "Something that matters. Build something that doesn't need your name carved in stone to be remembered. Use it to give someone else what no one gave me, a second chance without strings attached." Daniel didn't answer, but he didn't have to. He understood. And so did Roy. The following week, the family came back. Louder this time. With lawyers, with threats. They demanded to see documents, asked about control, tried to pressure the nursing director. But Roy said nothing. He watched them with a tired kindness, like a man who had already written the final chapter and was now just waiting for the ink to dry. Daniel stepped between them, calm, firm. "It's too late," he told them. "He made his choice," the son snarled. "What did he give you? What did you promise him?" Daniel looked straight into his eyes. "Nothing. That's why he chose me." The tension was a silent earthquake, but no one moved. No one knew what to say. Eventually they left, not defeated, but exposed. Because nothing reveals greed faster than the absence of control, and they had none. Later that night, Roy whispered, "Thank you," as Daniel helped him into bed. "They'll forget me eventually, but not you. You'll carry the right parts forward." Daniel sat in the dark after Roy fell asleep, staring at the journal on the nightstand. The room was silent, but it didn't feel empty. It felt planted, like something had been buried there, not in soil, but in spirit, waiting to grow. Long after the man was gone, he knew now the money was never the treasure. It was just the fuel. The real inheritance was the vision. And Daniel had been given the map. Roy was growing weaker. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just a little more each day, like a candle slowly surrendering to the night. His voice softened, his hands shook more often, and the light behind his eyes, once so sharp, began to flicker. But even as his body declined, his mind remained intact, focused, purposeful. He had said everything that needed saying, but Daniel could tell there was still one page left unturned. And it came one evening with almost no warning, in the soft hush of a room lit. Only by the golden blush of dusk, Daniel was helping him sit up when Roy reached out and gently gripped his wrist. There was more strength there than he expected, not physical, but intentional. Roy motioned toward the nightstand. "Bottom drawer," he said. Daniel opened it and found a single envelope marked with the word vision. He handed it to him. Roy didn't open it. Instead, he tapped it with his fingers. "This isn't a command. It's a question," he said. "What would you build if no one ever knew your name?" Daniel sat down, unsure of how to answer. Roy continued. "We spend our lives trying to be remembered. Statues, buildings, names on plaques. But the real question is, what survives when no one remembers where it came from? That's where legacy lives. Quietly. In impact." He gestured toward the envelope again. "Inside is the blueprint. Not for a home, not for a business, but for something bigger, something more human." His voice cracked slightly. "I started it. I never finished, because I didn't want them to use it for themselves. I needed to wait for someone who'd see the people before the profit." Daniel opened the envelope slowly. Inside was a single folded sheet of paper, lined, handwritten, detailed. It was a vision for a foundation, a center, not just for the elderly, but for the forgotten. A place where those left behind could feel seen again. Not a nursing home, but a home. Where dignity didn't come with a price tag, and silence wasn't mistaken for worthlessness. Roy had named it Hearthlight. At the top, underlined twice, was the phrase, "No one dies invisible." Daniel read the page twice, then looked at him. "You want me to build this?" Roy closed his eyes for a moment, breathing slow. "I want you to decide. This isn't about honoring me. It's about giving others what I never had when they stopped knocking on my door. If you build it without me in mind. Build it because you believe no one should be left behind to fade quietly." It wasn't a request, it was a release. The passing of a torch, not because Roy was ready to let go, but because Daniel was finally ready to carry it. And in that moment, sitting beside a man whose name would never be carved in gold, Daniel understood the depth of the inheritance he had received. It wasn't money, it was mission. The next day, Daniel contacted Langdon again. They began the early work, registering a foundation, outlining bylaws, securing the properties Roy had protected in anonymity for so many years. There were holdings in 5 states, a deed to an abandoned schoolhouse in Nebraska, a half-developed property on the outskirts of Santa Fe. All of them had been tucked away, untouched, waiting. Daniel didn't tell anyone. Not yet, not the staff, not even his closest friends. Because Roy's greatest lesson had been in the quiet, in doing something meaningful without demanding applause. When the spotlight's off, Roy had once said, you find out who's actually working. In the following weeks, Daniel began writing too, not in secret but not for public eyes. He outlined what Hearthlight would become, not a facility, a sanctuary, where music filled the halls, where staff were paid to listen, not just to monitor, where residents weren't patients but people, mentors, storytellers, artists in the final chapter of their greatest work at night. He'd return to Roy's room, sit beside him, and read from his notes. Roy listened with his eyes closed, nodding occasionally, smiling faintly. He didn't interrupt. He didn't correct. He had passed the story on, and now he simply wanted to hear what it sounded like in a new voice. One night, Daniel finished reading and asked, "What if I fail?" Roy opened his eyes, sharp despite the exhaustion. "Then you fail forward, and someone else will pick up what you started. That's legacy, not perfection. Continuity." Daniel didn't respond, but inside, something settled. Not peace exactly, but direction. Roy had given him more than an idea. He had handed him a living will, not one sealed by law, but one sealed by faith. A roadmap for how to make a forgotten man live forever. And though the sun had begun to set outside the window, Daniel knew the light wouldn't fade, not if he kept walking the path that had been built in silence, brick by unseen brick. Roy didn't say he was ready. He didn't need to. His body had already started whispering what his mouth refused to admit. The way he slept longer each day, the way his breathing became slower, more deliberate. He still asked Daniel to read from his notes each evening, but he no longer commented. He simply listened, as if he was storing every word, every hope, in a place beyond this world, somewhere he could carry it with him. The nurses began visiting more often, their tones shifting from clinical to compassionate. One left a small candle burning near his bed, saying it brought peace to residents in their final days. Another placed a framed photo of a younger Roy, one they found in an old drawer, on the nightstand beside his journal. The man in the photo stood tall in a pressed suit, hands in his pockets, smiling like he had 100 plans in motion. Daniel often caught himself staring at that image, trying to bridge the space between who Roy had been and who he had become. But Roy wasn't a fading man clinging to his past. He was a man walking toward the edge with clarity. On the last evening, Daniel came in after work, later than usual. The hallway was quieter than normal. No bingo night, no hallway chatter. Just soft footsteps and the muffled sound of a rainstorm, beginning outside. Roy was awake when he entered. Not asleep, not gone, just still, waiting. Daniel sat beside him, pulled out the notebook as he always did. But Roy lifted a frail hand. "Not tonight," he said softly. "Tonight you tell me something that's not written down." Daniel paused, unsure. Then he took a breath and said, "I didn't have a father who showed up, not really. I spent most of my life waiting to be noticed by someone who wasn't looking. But then I met you. And somehow you saw me before I even spoke. You gave me a reason to stay when I was about to walk away from everything." Roy closed his eyes, smiling faintly. "You were never invisible, Daniel. Just waiting for the right mirror." The storm outside grew louder, the rain tapping on the window like a steady heartbeat. Roy's breathing slowed in rhythm with it. The air in the room changed, not heavier, not darker, just deeper, like something sacred had stepped in. Daniel stood, unsure what to do, but Roy opened his eyes one last time. "It's time," he whispered. "Don't hold me here. I've already gone where I needed to." Daniel leaned forward, took his hand, and said quietly, "You're not leaving. You're becoming something more." Roy didn't reply, but a single tear slipped from the corner of his eye, not of fear, not of regret, but of release. And with one final breath, slow and almost imperceptible, he let go. Daniel stayed in the room long after the monitor stopped, after the nurses came in and did what they had done 100 times before. He stayed when the lights dimmed and the rain slowed and the night finally swallowed the hallway. He sat beside the body of a man who had lived not loudly but meaningfully. A man who had rewritten what inheritance meant. A man who had passed on not just a fortune, but a foundation. The next morning the sun rose quietly. The home moved on, meals were served, medications distributed. Laughter returned to the lounge, like it always did. But room 107 was empty, not vacant, just sacred now. The staff spoke of Roy with soft reverence. Some of the other residents cried, though they barely knew him. Because even in silence he had left a mark. Daniel returned to that room one last time. The journal still rested on the nightstand, waiting like a dog that didn't know its master wouldn't be back. He opened it to the final page. A line had been added recently, maybe in the last few days. The handwriting shakier than before, but still clearly his. "When they forget my name, let them remember what I gave. That will be enough." Daniel closed the journal, took a breath, and left the room for the last time. But in his pocket was a folded blueprint. In his mind, a growing vision. And in his chest, a promise. Because the man who died in silence didn't die alone, and he wouldn't be forgotten. As long as Daniel had a voice, it was a small chapel. No cathedral, no grand ceremony. Just 4 rows of dark wooden pews and a single white rose lying atop a closed casket. The nameplate read Roy Thomas Ellis, but no titles followed. No beloved father or husband. Just the name, simple, honest. Daniel sat in the second row. The first row had been left empty, intentionally, for the family, though they never came. They had been informed, of course. Proper calls were made, emails sent. Roy's son had even replied, cold and clipped. "Thank you for the update." No questions, no condolences, no intent to attend, not even a thin attempt at closure. Daniel wasn't surprised. Grief is a mirror, and some people avoid it because they know what it will reflect. A few staff members from the home attended, along with 2 residents in wheelchairs, and the quiet nurse who always left a candle burning in Roy's room. That was it. Less than 10 people. No slideshow music, no framed collages of childhood memories. Only the steady sound of the wind outside and the gentle creak of the pews beneath shifting weight. The officiant, a soft-spoken man in his 60s, asked if anyone would like to speak. For a moment, no one moved. Then Daniel stood. He walked to the front and stood beside the casket. No notes, no podium, just breath and memory. "Most people will never know who Roy Ellis really was," he began. "They'll never know what he built, or how much he gave, or what he chose to protect. And if they do learn, they'll measure it in dollars, in assets. But that's not the inheritance he left behind." He paused, eyes locked on the polished wood before him. Roy Ellis was a man who understood that silence can be sacred, that doing the right thing doesn't require witnesses. He spent his final years in a place no one wants to end up, a place people think is the end of the road. But Roy turned it into something else, a classroom, a fortress, a vault for the lessons no one teaches out loud. Daniel scanned the room. catching eyes filled with quiet tears and respectful stillness. He didn't raise his voice, but he changed. Mine. He didn't seek recognition, but he saw people who had been forgotten. And when he had nothing left to give, he gave everything anyway. Not to the loudest voice, but to the one who listened. He let the silence stretch, let it honor the man more than words ever could. He told me once that he didn't want to be remembered for what he left behind, but for who he trusted to carry it. So here I am, not to mourn, but to promise. That, what he began in shadows, will grow in the light. He stepped down and returned to his seat. No applause, just the soft echo of truth settling in the bones of the room. The ceremony ended without music. Roy's casket was carried out by staff, not family. No one followed it to the burial site, except Daniel. Alone, the gravesite was quiet, tucked in a corner beneath a weeping oak. As they lowered the casket, Daniel stepped forward and placed a folded piece of paper on top. It wasn't the will, it wasn't a speech. It was the first draft of Heartlight's mission statement, written in his own hand. A promise made tangible. He whispered, "You live forever now," and walked away. That night, back at his apartment, Daniel opened his laptop, registered a domain, sent the first email to a foundation planner, called Langdon and gave him the go-ahead to release the next phase of funds. The next morning, the obituary went live. It didn't mention millions. It didn't mention betrayal. It simply read, "Roy Ellis passed peacefully, remembered by those who knew how to listen. His legacy will live through acts of dignity and second chances." No one commented, no one shared, but somewhere a door had opened, and the man who died alone was already rebuilding something for those who would never again be left behind. It took exactly 1 year from Roy's funeral to the day Hearthlight opened its doors. A small building on the edge of town, remodeled from the bones of an abandoned library, now reborn in soft colors and warm light. There was no ceremony, no ribbon cutting or press release, just an unlocked door, a welcome sign hand-painted by volunteers, and the quiet arrival of the first residents. People who had stories but no one to listen to them, hands weathered by life, eyes still waiting to be seen. Daniel stood in the main hall, watching as the space filled with slow footsteps and cautious hope. The walls weren't sterile. They were lined with photographs, not of donors or founders, but of moments. A grandmother teaching a child to paint, a man playing the piano alone at dusk, a nurse sitting beside a resident just holding their hand. There were no plaques, no dedication to Roy by name. But he was there in every corner. The mission was simple. No one dies invisible. At Hearthlight, they weren't patients. They were mentors, storytellers, survivors. Each person received a welcome kit not with instructions, but with a blank journal and a pen. A gentle nudge to write down whatever they still wanted to say. Because words, Roy had once said, outlive flesh when they are carried in other people's hands. Daniel walked into the first room, room 1, and sat across from a man who had been silent for weeks. He placed a journal on the table and said, "You don't have to say anything now, but one day, when you're ready, I'll be here to read it." The man nodded, eyes glassy, and reached for the pen like it weighed more than his entire body. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom. The soil had been planted by community members. Children came on weekends to help water and weed. There was laughter in the courtyard, real laughter, the kind that grows when people stop being treated like burdens and start being seen as blessings. Volunteers didn't wear uniforms. Staff were trained not just in care, but in presence. Hearthlight didn't run on schedules. It ran on stories. One afternoon, a woman named Elsie asked Daniel who built the place. He smiled and said, "A man you never met, but who knew exactly how you feel." He didn't say Roy's name. He didn't need to, because the legacy wasn't in the bricks. It was in the way Elsie smiled when someone remembered her favorite tea, in the way she began to hum again after years of silence, in the way her daughter, who hadn't visited in 4 years, returned just to sit by her side and listen. Donations came in slowly, not from corporations, but from the families of those who had lived their final days with dignity. From strangers who read about Hearthlight and said, "I wish this had existed for my father, for my grandmother, for me." Each dollar was used to open another room, another chair by another window, another journal waiting to be filled at night. Daniel would stay late, walking the halls with a quietness that mirrored Roy's. He would pass by open doors and hear bits of old songs, stories being retold, laughter cracking through the weight of old grief. And in those moments, he would feel it again, the echo of a promise once made in a dying man's room. Use it to give someone else what no one gave me. And he had, on the 1-year anniversary of Roy's death, Daniel returned to the nursing home. Room 107 had been assigned to someone new now, the plaque replaced, the furniture shifted. But the air still held a stillness, a softness. He stood in the hallway, alone, and whispered, "It's built, and it's full." He reached into his coat and pulled out a photograph. Roy, sitting on a bench, journal in hand, eyes looking past the frame into something only he could see. Daniel pinned it to the community board with a note beneath. "If you were seen because of him, keep someone else from being invisible." That was the only monument Roy would ever have. And it was enough because legacies aren't always loud. Sometimes they walk beside you quietly, building something that outlasts the names carved in stone. Something that grows. Hearthlight would expand. It would be replicated. It would become a place where no one asked, "How much do you have?" but "What do you want to leave behind?" And in every room, every voice, every final goodbye, Roy Ellis would live again, not in memory, but in motion. If this story moved something inside you, don't let it end here. Share it, not just with your voice, but with your actions. Take a moment to leave a comment and tell us, who is the person in your life that deserves to be remembered, even if the world has forgotten their name? And if you believe that no one should ever die invisible, subscribe to this channel. We're building a place where stories like Roy's never fade, where every goodbye becomes the beginning of something greater. Thank you for watching, for feeling, and for carrying this legacy forward.